All right, so hopefully you completed the activity on page 143 through 145, and you're feeling a little bit more comfortable writing our null and alternative hypotheses. Again, that's in every problem that we do in this unit, we are going to write null and alternative hypotheses. So we're going to get a lot of practice with writing those. With that being said, when we run our hypothesis test, and this is at the bottom of page 139, these notes that are on the screen. But what we're going to do is we're going to test what the calculator does when we run a hypothesis test is it's testing the null hypothesis directly. It is testing the probability that the null hypothesis will take place. So what's going to happen is we're going to run the test. It's going to give us a p-value or a probability of that null hypothesis taking place. From there, we are either going to reject the null hypothesis or fail to reject the null hypothesis. We never accept them. It's either we reject or we fail to reject. And how we do this is we compare it to some threshold. We call it a significance level or an alpha. So we're going to set some sort of significance level. And honestly, sometimes I'll tell you, sometimes you can just pick your own. But we select one of these three values, and sometimes we use a different value, but most common we use are these three. So we select some threshold of, 0.1, 0.05, or 0.01, and then we're going to run the test, and we're going to get a p-value. The p-value is the probability of the null hypothesis taking place. If the p-value is low, that means that the probability of the null hypothesis is taking place is very, 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 very low. So I learned this when I was in high school statistics. It helped me remember it. Hopefully it will help you. It sounds silly, but it does help you remember it. If the p is low, you reject the HO, or the null hypothesis. But when the p is low, you reject the HO. If the p is greater than your significance level, then you fail to reject. And as we start practicing this, when we're running actual hypothesis tests next class, you'll see more in context what I mean. The big thing from today I want you to take away is that we are not accepting anything. So if you turn to page 140 of your workbook, there's notes on this. But we are either rejecting or failing to reject. Failing to reject is basically saying there's not enough evidence to warrant a rejection. We're not certain. There's strong evidence against the null hypothesis, or there's not enough evidence against the null hypothesis to get rid of it. So we just have to remember that we're never going to say that we accept something, because that would be saying like with certainty that we know. And even with statistics, we're never going to claim certainty, because even with a really, really low probability, there's still a chance that it could happen. So, right, even if I have a 0.00005, yes, that probability is super low, but that doesn't mean that it's impossible that it could happen. So failing to reject or rejecting is the terms that we're going to use in this unit. So if you go ahead and turn your notes to page 141. Actually, if we turn to 142 first, you have this in your notes on page 142, and this is just kind of the idea, kind of like the language that we're going to use in this unit. So we have our original claim, and then in this case, when we reject, our original claim was our null hypothesis. So when we wrote our null, we wrote that as the claim. And then if we reject it, we could say something, there is sufficient evidence to warrant rejection of the claim that, and then we restate the claim. And again, once we start doing examples, this is going to feel very routine. But this is kind of the flow chart we use to make sure we're using the correct verbiage or the correct structure in stating our conclusion. Every time we write a conclusion, it's always going to be about, is there enough evidence to support the claim, or is there not enough evidence to support the claim? And then we rewrite whatever that claim that we picked was. So again, we're going to see that a lot in the next couple days. Going back to kind of our rejection versus acceptance, if you think about the fact, right, we don't ever claim in the justice system that somebody is innocent or guilty, right? We say guilty or not guilty. It's kind of the same thing here. We're never going to prove, right? We're never proving innocence. We're saying you're innocent until proven guilty. Kind of the same thing here. We're saying we're keeping the null hypothesis until given a reason to reject it. So kind of along the same lines as innocent and guilty. We don't use innocent in our court system. We use guilty or not guilty. We're going to use rejection or fail to reject. So what we're going to talk about this last part of this today is just the errors that can come with whatever decision that we make. So like I said, this whole unit is writing a null and alternative hypothesis. We run the test, and then we're going to make some claim. So there are several claims that can be made. I don't know why I'm still writing. There we go. There are several claims that can be made. So if you reject the null hypothesis, and that was the correct thing to do, right? This is correct. I rejected and it was false. Great. If I fail to reject and it's true, again, we made the correct decision in that situation. We kept the null hypothesis and the null hypothesis was true, right? This is what we decide versus the reality. So in this case, I rejected it and I should have. That's the correct answer. I failed to reject and I should have. Correct answer. So those two categories we don't worry so much about. They're not errors. They're the correct answer. What we're really going to focus on here is these errors that you make if you reject when it was actually true or you fail to reject when it was false. So again, this is going only off of the null hypothesis, but a type 1 error is mistaking the rejection of a null hypothesis when it is actually true. And a type 2 error is failing to reject the null hypothesis when it is actually false. So those are our two types of errors that we're going to focus on in our examples. And this chart is on top of page 141. So we're going to look at some examples and talk about the errors that could be made. So if you go ahead and look at page 141, we're going to look at some examples and the type of error you could make with them. So testing for Alzheimer's disease can be a long and expensive process consisting of lengthy testing and medical diagnoses. A group of researchers devised a 7-minute test to serve as a quick screen for the disease. A man is getting tested for Alzheimer's. A man is getting tested for Alzheimer's, and I'm not sure why it's repeated twice. That is just a typo on my part. All right, so if we write our null and alternative hypothesis, right, our null is that there is no change or no difference, but is our equality. So we would say, let's say our null hypothesis is that the man does have Alzheimer's. Then our alternative hypothesis would be that the man does not. In this one, we don't really have a claim here. We're not testing one way or the other. Okay, so a type 1 error is when we reject the null hypothesis when the null hypothesis was actually true. So we reject the fact that the man has Alzheimer's. So we claim the man does not have Alzheimer's when it was actually true. So when he actually does. So if we wanted to talk about a possible consequence, right? We just told him he does not when he does. So that's a false diagnosis. He now is not getting medication that he needs because we don't think he has Alzheimer's. So then a type 2 error is we fail to reject, so we keep the null hypothesis when it's actually false. So we claim he does have Alzheimer's, when actually he does not. So this would be giving him medication that he doesn't need. He could be making life arrangements or spending, like spending financially like he's going to pass away soon when he's not, or is not going to pass away of Alzheimer's. So it's still a false diagnosis, but kind of has different consequences in that realm. Okay, so let's talk about this last example in 141. So assume that we conduct a hypothesis test of the claim that the method of gender selection increases the likelihood of the baby girl. What is the probability that the probability of having a girl is greater than 0.5. So remember, your null hypothesis is always equality. So your null hypothesis would be that it equals 0.5, but we're testing the claim that P is greater than 0.5. All right, so then our type 1 error, right? Our type 1 error is we reject the null hypothesis when the null hypothesis is actually true. So we claim that it does increase the likelihood when in reality it actually does not. Our odds are equal. Right? This is actually true. So we rejected this, though we should not have. We said it was more than, but it's not. So this is false advertisement, giving people hope that they could have a girl when actually their odds are exactly the same. It could be, fraud, taking people's money, even though they can't increase the likelihood. So then the type 2 error is we failed to reject the null hypothesis, so we're going to keep this when actually this is true, or the null hypothesis is false. So we claim that it doesn't increase the likelihood when it actually does. So this is, in medicine that we're not giving accurate medical information. People that may want to use this service will use it because they don't think it helps, but it actually does. So they're just not taking full advantage of the medication they could be using. So that could be a possible consequence. Okay, so your homework is page 201 through 202. So hopefully that will give you some help with writing null and alternative hypothesis and then working on those type 1 and type 2 errors.